Alright, we're going to be recording the Secrets of Strixhaven Standard Pioneer set review. There's no general characteristics, I'm just going to talk about my thoughts of the cards. There's about 70 cards today, not nearly as deep as Lorwyn Eclipsed. But yeah, let's get right into it with the first card, Dawning Archaic. We've seen many other types of cost reducers based off instants and sorceries before in multiple formats. Obviously, popular staples, currently in standard with Eddie Mercrab and Hearth Elemental. This one is certainly unique in that it's colorless, though I don't think that substantially changes the types of decks it in. Typically, they will be blue-based decks, so there's not a massive difference. This one is also legendary, which does somewhat limit. It's not an elemental, so you can't really play it in the Sunderflock deck. But what it does have that the other ones currently in standard don't have is it does have recurring value when you cheat it into play. So not the first turn, but the next turn, every turn after that, you can effectively Snapcaster Mage something, out of your graveyard for free. Though there are also combo kills with it, similar to the Temur Harmonizer deck in both Standard and Pioneer. You can play this cheaply. You can cast a Wild Ride on it. You can attack it, and then something that doubles its power or effectively gives Double Strike, Temur Battle Rage, Bulk Up, something of that ilk. Um, uh, Not really sure it's going to make a ton of waves. You likely need this card to have a fairly substantial discount to be playable, at least in current standard. So, like, you need 7 or more instants and sorceries for it to be a good card, as crazy as that is to believe. But I think that's just kind of where we are at with standard right now. In Pioneer, it is substantially easier to enable that. You have cards like Otherworldly Gaze and Traverse the Ulvenwald, stuff like that, that you can use to more quickly enable this. In Standard, you can kind of get some turbo going on because we have Cash Grab and I believe it's Midnight Tilling, and so you do have some redundancy there, but Pioneer certainly has more potential for this type of effect. Antiquities on the Loose. This is just a card that is fairly reminiscent of something like, say, History of Benalia, though not nearly as snowbally on the turns that you play it, but does give you the value up front. The main thing with this that is worth talking about, obviously, is it checks if it was cast from anywhere other than hand. So if you pair this with something like Legend of Roku and you've exiled this off the top of your library, or if you give this a cheaper flashback than 6 mana via the actual card flashback or some other thing that enables this. In standard, maybe there's some potential with this. 3 mana 4/4 isn't like the most exciting, though there is some amount of ways to kind of cheat this on turn 4. You can cast it. I believe there's 2 different ways, potentially 3, but I think there's mainly 2. It does put a counter on each spirit you control, so in multiples, if you cast this on 3 and then you cast on 4, it's not just the tokens that you make, it's also the ones that you made on turn 3. So that curve is actually pretty good. But in Pioneer, I think there's some more interesting things you can do with it. You can play it in with the red-white Pia decks. You can play it in some sort of Jeskai shell with See the Truth, so you have some redundancy with some of the flashback effects from there. There's obviously more potential spirits in that regard. I'm not really sure that it's really going to make very many waves outside of that, but there are some interesting things to think about. One thing you can do in Pioneer that I've been itching to do for a while is go back to playing Goblin Dark Dwellers, and so then it's 5 mana, make a 4/4 and 2 3/3s, and it doesn't quite line up very well in the Boomerang Basics, Reckless Rage type Corey Steelcutter nonsense, but still pretty large board presence. Daydream. It's definitely not an ephemerate. Sorcery speed blinks are substantially weaker than instant speed ones, though obviously this has implications in standard with some of the warp things, Quantum Riddler, stuff like that. It having flashback and getting you 2 value means it kind of draws you a card, similar to the one that currently blinks like frogs and stuff like that, where if you exile one of those, you draw a card that you can do with Thunder Trap Trainer, Splash Portal, I believe. But the thing that this draws is it always draws you a second cast. So that's kind of the way to think about flashback in a lot of circumstances. Is this is a splash portal that always draws you a second splat, another splash portal. Though the second one doesn't always, but that's kind of the gist of the first one. So pretty reasonable. Nice to have some redundancy. Certainly, I think arguably better in white with current standard, even though this obviously has the upside of putting a counter on the creature. The main value is the mono white or black white Momo deck in particular. Doesn't have to play blue in order to get um, some sort of turn three scam something in, which is funny because even the versions that do play blue, they don't play Splash Portal currently, but and you would possibly consider playing this instead of Splash Portal, even in decks that wouldn't that would play like Thundertrap Trainer and stuff, like some of the more value oriented versions. But this is just enough better in terms of castability that you would play it likely even in decks that could play Splash Portal, but that choose not to. Okay, Elite Interceptor. This is just very similar to Novice Inspector. Not a super playable card in Pioneer or Standard currently. Novice Inspector, that is. And this one doesn't is noticeably worse with certain types of interactions. It doesn't give you any artifacts to enable, but it does kind of clear a blocker out of the way for a turn, which is quite interesting. Uh, so we'll see. Emeritus of Truce. This is, in my opinion, the best Emeritus going into set release. Uh, I've seen a lot of people kind of whatever on this because this one doesn't enter prepared, so you don't always get the value. But it is pretty reasonable in Standard and Pioneer for you to cast this on 3 or 4, give yourself the token, and still prepare it. And that's incredibly powerful. In the scenarios where you give your opponent the 1/1 and then prepare this, what that ends up meaning is it's effectively similar to a Skyclave apparition. It's not that dissimilar, but sometimes you get the upside of just having a being far enough behind on board that you get a Beza type effect, and so I think that's really powerful. Being able to hit it off of Coco is super important in Pioneer. I would expect this to see play in that, even though obviously the Coco decks do get a good amount of creatures into play. Just having more options is nice. The big one in Standard is this is a good catch-up mechanic creature that doesn't lose to the green Urboroi Badgermole Cup decks in the same way that Beza does. If you play Beza against these Urboroi decks, oftentimes they just go way over the top that the 4/5 body and the 2/1/1s and even the life that you've gained just doesn't matter. Your opponent can Crater Hoof, they can Bright Glass Gearhole can just get the Beza out of the way, and then you've got 2 shitty 1/1s. But this always gives you game in those types of scenarios. If you play this on 4, you give yourself the 1/1, and then you exile their creature, that is a significantly better value play for you than playing Beza. So I think this card is quite good. Um, yeah. Erode. So Path to Exile is back. The slight differences, nothing substantial. People have kind of been asking for Path to Exile and Pioneer for a while. Having it in Standard seems fine. I think people are generally overhyping this card. Generally, these effects are pretty bad, and as someone who played an extremely large amount of Modern back in the Path to Exile heyday, Path to Exile itself was also quite bad in Modern, even when it was the card that was played, the primary removal spell. Giving your opponent a land is even more of a drawback now than it has been traditionally. The fact that very few decks ever run out of cards in hand, and they typically are usually constrained by mana as opposed to cards in every turn of the game. Where this does have potential is, I think, primarily in Pioneer, where sometimes you just need a 1 mana answer to hit Greasefang on the draw, or things of that nature. In Standard, it can hit Kaido, which is relevant because uh, Blue Eye Control in particular only gets to play so many Get Losts, and you usually don't want to try and rely on Aang's Iceberg in a format that has a bunch of Spider Sense and Tishana's Tidebinders in those kinds of decks. Also, Get Lost being hit by Spell Snare is relevant, whereas this can dodge that. It does have some implications in Modern and Legacy, where it can hit some cheap planeswalkers. But I think in terms of Standard and Pioneer, totally happy to have a card like Path to Exile. Though I don't think it's necessarily worth playing a deck like, say, Blue-White Control simply because you have access to it. I think it's actually better in the decks like Momo or in Pioneer, it's probably a lot better in, say, mono white humans or blue white spirits, where usually they're closing the game out pretty quick and they just need cheap removal spells at instant speed against the prowess decks and things of that nature. So I think against those, with those decks, it's exceptional. With humans in particular, you do traditionally have very little agency in, say, the Greasefang matchup, where oftentimes you just need to deal with Greasefang, and your options are playing a 2-mana removal spell in a Thalia deck. So even though this is still going to get taxed by Thalia, paying 2 mana versus 3 mana means you can still double spell. Okay, group project. Uh, for those of us who've played Pauper, Battle Screech, this card is, not nearly as powerful, but fairly reminiscent of that. Notably an uncommon, so not going to be legal in that format. But in both Standard and Pioneer, maybe there's some kind of Convoke type deck that wants access to this. Obviously, you're not really going to have 3 untapped creatures on turn 2 when you cast this, though theoretically in Pioneer you could, if you go 1-drop into Ornithopter, cast this, flash it back. That's not even better than just playing Corey Steelcutter, though this has some interesting applications in that it does trigger some of the effects that care about a card leaving your graveyard. It is in sorcery, which can matter for some other effects. But would be very curious to see how this lines up if the prior card that works in the Pia deck would be played with this. So maybe you can play it in those decks together. Maybe you play it with Corey Steelcutter as like play this on turn 2, play Corey Steelcutter on turn 3, play a 1-mana play. You get a token from Corey Steelcutter, blah blah blah. You can tap that and just vomit onto the board pretty quick, I think. In Standard, I'm not really sure that there's going to be home for anything like this. It's difficult to go wide with just normal aggro creatures in a format with Badgermal Cub because the green decks just go so much bigger, and the red decks, which is like the Izzet decks, have access to a bunch of cheap removal, like Boomerang Basics ends up being a real removal spell against this type of card. It does get hit by Spell Snare, and if you are tapping creatures, then that means that sometimes you have less chump blockers. There's also Pyroclasms in the format, so I'm not really sure it holds up in Standard, but it is a pretty nice card to think about. Informed Inkwright. So this is for all you Hero of Precinct 1 lovers out there from 2019 era Standard. Instead of triggering off of multicolor spells, you have to cast a sorcery that targets a creature. Now, generally speaking, we're not going to be playing pump spells, I think, with the black-white repartee type cards in Standard or Pioneer. Though you can. We have seen red-white heroic, in particular, in Pioneer, be a deck that has popped off now and again. But I think the main thing is, because this doesn't say creature you control, you can actually play it in more mid-range decks. It doesn't have to be this protection pump spell type deck. You can just play this and then play some kill spells on your opponent's creatures and get some extra 1/1s. In Standard, I think that's mostly where we're going to see it. I don't anticipate playing it with any sort of ley line of resonance type nonsense. I fully expect you to be playing this and then playing a kill spell on your opponent's creature, getting a 1/1, maybe playing a second kill spell on turn 4, and just kind of curving out like that, getting value off of your kill spells. Again, not really sure that even gets you very, very far in the current format, but the tokens having flying actually is fairly relevant. Okay, Exhibition Tidecaller. Not quite a Hedron Crab, and I don't really expect this to open up very many decks in either Standard or Pioneer, but people do like playing casual mill decks, and this could theoretically be some kind of WinCon-esque type effect in Excruciator, or against Excruciator, rather. And maybe it's like a sideboard card against slower control decks in like spell elementals or something. In Pioneer, a 1 mana O2 it may as well just like not be a stat line, and it does die to a lot, and you're dying on turn 3 and 4 pretty often. So, uh, unless you're going dedicated mill, in which case, like, yeah, I mean, then this card is pretty good. It's likely going to mill you 3 cards on turn 2, and then another 3 on turn 3, which already puts it as basically the best 1 drop you can play in mill. So maybe it's good there, but I would expect this to see more of like a spell elementals type card, Orchestra Sheet, or something like that. Maybe there is more going on that cares about like density of cards in graveyard. There are some like combo-y type decks that you could theoretically build in Standard and Pioneer that care about that, like Crackling Drake nonsense, where you just want to fill up cards in graveyard pretty quick. Flow State, by far one of the most hyped cards coming into the set, reminiscent of Stock Up or Expressive Iteration in terms of potential power level, though it does have like a reasonable restriction. I have actually played a lot of this card in the early access, and I think it's actually pretty good in both Standard and Pioneer. The restriction is real, though it is not nearly as hard as people are making it out to be. Standard is not really a format anymore that's dominated by main deck Soul Guide Lanterns like it was pre-Lorwyn Eclipsed. But even with that, having a sorcery is not that bad with Sleight of Hand and the new 3 damage spell. Also, like other copies of Flow State will also trigger it. Boomerang basics, so really not too bad. It's a little bit harder in something like Spell Elementals versus Prowess, where you don't really get to leverage Boomerang basics as much, though I'm a fan of playing more of the hybrid of those 2 decks, where you play Slick Shot, Eddie Garp Crab, and Storm Chaser's Talent. And even if you want to go even further and not play Slick Shot and just play the full Spell Elementals package, I've had some like pretty good success just playing Spell Elementals with Storm Chaser's Talent Boomerang basics anyway, because that package is really good, and that makes a card like Flow State substantially better. But yeah, card is quite good. Fractal Anomaly. Card's probably bad, but who knows? Proph's Eidetic Memory is banned. So it's kind of funny to have this card, in that same kind of format. I don't think it's too bad to actually play this on like double spell turns. I would kind of be looking at like the Tiger Seal type decks, which we haven't really seen in a bit, but it's kind of like the inverse, where Tiger Seal you could play on turn 1 to help curve out. This you can't really play on turn 1, but it could be a good like mid-game play where you double spell with this, and you have a 1 mana 2/2 or 3/3, depending on Winter Night Stories and other nonsense like that. Still plays well with Frostcliff Siege, which I think is the best possible angle for the Tiger Seal decks anyway. Harmonized Trio. Card is almost certainly bad, though it we have seen multiple things in this set that care about going wide. Um, maybe this is a better upside than getting an extra 2/2 spirit, though brainstorming without easy access to shuffling or, getting rid of the cards isn't actually all that powerful. It's not that much different than just casting an anticipate effect anyway. So I think like even then the upside is not even like fantastic, but there is a good amount of like surveil going on and stuff like that. I'm not really sure, what decks can afford to be tapping that many creatures, because we already don't play Warden of the Inner Sky in either Standard or Pioneer currently. And when you do tend to see decks like that in Pioneer, they mostly tend to be like Boros Convoke, which I don't think really wants to splash blue for this. Maybe it splashes blue for some other cards, and then maybe you play like some number of this. But that tends to be about it. Usually you want to just like tap your creatures to play like a giant fatty and then kill the opponent pretty quick. Like you already have things like Novice Inspector and stuff. Um, Aside from that, like the Mockingbird decks tend to be Badgermole Cub, which likely aren't really looking for this kind of effect either. So I don't really think it has a home at the moment. I think the best thing it has going for it is that it is a merfolk, and it's a playable cheap merfolk. for any sort of Merfolk gamers. Okay, Jadzi, Steward of Fate, is yet another in a line of 3 mana, 2 power creature that they've given us basically in every set for the last, 12 to 16 months kind of range. That is, comes into play, draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards as a 3 drop. Like we have a lot of them in standard, and I really don't understand why we have so many because very few of them end up seeing play. We've got Kiora, Steamcore Scholar, etc. This one does have some potential in that it actually scales on its own into winning the game, quote unquote. At 5 mana, you make two 2/2s, which is not great, but a reasonable rider onto an effect like this. And then obviously it can scale up from there. So totally reasonable. What this one has going for it that something like Kiora, I think, and Steamcore Scholar doesn't, is that it doesn't die to like burst lightning effects. So 2/4 is a significantly better stat line. Okay. Muse Seeker, the inverse artist's talent, a little bit more vulnerable. Mono blue elf, of course, because why wouldn't it be? But yeah, I think the main thing with this is ignoring the 5 or more mana was meant to cast a spell restriction and largely evaluating this as a, hey, I cast a spell and I loot. And can be powerful in that regard. We haven't really seen very much of those types of cards before. Obviously, we all know how powerful Artist Talent is. This is likely worse overall because it is a creature and it gives you valid removal spell targets, but maybe some redundancy of that effect is what some of these Monument Lessons decks may be looking for. Tide Choreographer. This is definitely not a Quantum Riddler. Though it is really interesting to think about the restriction on this. It shouldn't actually be too bad to be able to cast this on like turn 4, as a double spell turn, as a 2-mana 2/2 and draw 2 cards. Again, like, that's not really what standard is about right now, but, having the option I think could be nice. Skycoach Conductor, definitely not exactly the same as Restoration Angel, though overall better. And I think we have some decks in standard that would be more than happy to play this card. Demir, but, not really playable, but I think, like, this goes a bit. And the Momo deck in particular. You can go turn 1 Momo, turn 2 cast this, you can attack, and then you just have it prepped for the rest of the game. And sure, it can't prep to save itself, but it can prep to save Momo, or whatever, or to blink your Quantum Riddler, stuff like that. So I think it's pretty good. In Pioneer, it doesn't really shoehorn into anything nearly as well, though. Spirits is less of a Spirits deck and more of a blue-white flying tempo deck anyway. So, okay. First black card, Arnon Deathboon Botanist. The only reason this is on here is the curve with Voice of Victory. If you go turn 2 Voice of Victory, turn 3 play this, and then you attack, the mobilized tokens will trigger this. So that's actually a pretty aggressive curve. Takes your Voice of Victory that would normally deal 3 damage on turn 3, and it can end up dealing 7 points of damage. So pretty good. Though 3-mana 2/2, even with Death Touch, is not particularly playable in Standard or Pioneer. But that is like the main idea behind it would be Voice of Victory. Theoretically, you can do some silly nonsense in Pioneer where you play it with Rally the Ancestors and a bunch of creatures with like 0 base toughness, like Stonecoil Serpents, Hangerback Walker, stuff like that, and you just cast it, bring them all back, they instantly die to state-based effects, and then your opponent dies. That is theoretically something you can do. Maybe it'll be a fun deck to play it a weekly or something. End of the Hunt. This is similar to Blot Out, which had rotated with the prior rotation. It is sorcery speed, so it is a bit worse against Kaido, but 2 mana does make it more playable against other decks in the format. So this is your I really don't want to lose to Kaido or Enduring Curiosity type of effect. So. Okay. Grave Researcher. Fairly reminiscent of zombify alternatives that we've had, notably we have a 1 mana 1/1 that can return the Valgavoth's Faithful. Um, so this is like fairly similar, I think, at least in theory, in terms of what types of decks you'll be playing it in, simply because of the preparation requirement. It does require you to have creatures in your graveyard, even though you can reanimate something from an opponent's graveyard. So it does play well in like the fair games, but it is not the easiest to enable. So pretty cool card though. Lecturing Scorn Mage, another one of the playable repartee cards, similar to the one that we saw, the white 2-drop before. This one is a 1-drop that is playable in the Fatal Push type decks in Pioneer and Standard. I'm playing this on one, and then I'm playing some kill spells. I'm not sure how many something like Dimir can play, when in many cases they don't even max out on Spygoth Sirens, and sometimes they don't even play Cecil either. So I'm not really sure that they'll be able to play very much of it, though it should, at least in theory, change how people think about deck building in black mid-range decks now. There are some instants and sorceries that can target your own creatures or the opponent's. Notably, there's 2 playable ones that we'll get to later that are in the black-white colors. Okay, Melcio Vane's New Dean. So this one is, I believe, one of the only infusion cards that has an intervening if. Infusion is a mechanic that cares about if you gained life. Generally, it works favorably with the like Soul Sisters type effects where they enter. This one still does because it checks on end step. It just means that the trigger won't even go on the stack if you haven't gained any life. So you do need like some sort of effect already in play that's going to gain you life. But this is another one of those. We have quite a few in Standard of 3 mana, 2 power creature, make tokens, do more stuff. Not really sure where I would expect to see play, though if there is a home for it, it's likely any sort of playable Amalia deck, which did get some upgrades from this set, because this does let you get back Amalia if you have enough Soul Sisters in play, and it's just a bit more of a value. Okay, Poisoner's Apprentice, another one of the infusion cards. This one is not an intervening if, so this one will check on resolution if you've gained life. So what you can do with this is you can just play it with any Soul Sister effect, Hinterland Sanctifier in particular, and then you play this and you just basically kill any medium-sized creature or less. So I think this card's actually pretty good, especially in Standard. If there's any sort of playable black-white deck that like plays Hinterland Sanctifier and stuff, like Amalia, whatever, then this definitely has a home there. Amalia is very interesting to think about in the context of like a Badger Mole Cup Standard, because it does allow you to win board states where your opponent has a much larger board, because she's just going to blow up all the creatures. So this and Amalia and some of these other life gain payoffs could be enough to justify playing the heavy amounts of Soul Sisters effects that we have, because we have the green 1-drop and we have 2 white 1-drops that will also work as creatures that gain you life, plus Case of the Uneaten Feast. So there is a lot of enablers that you could potentially play. Okay, Scheming Silvertongue. This one, another life gain payoff, but a bit, less, I think, good as a life gain payoff than the others, though it itself does help enable it. Gaining 2 life means you need to gain 1 more life in addition to this attacking, which I don't think is all that easy to do, except in like Hinterland Sanctifier decks. Though this does still work totally fine with, say, like Deep Cavern Bats or Amalia, things of that nature. It does work pretty well, I think, in terms of like castability of Sign in Blood in probably the black-white decks rather than the dedicated 3-color life gain potential decks. But 2 mana 1/3 flying lifelink is not a terrible place to be. Okay, Tragedy Feaster. This one is getting a bit of hype because of the curve with Unholy Annex, similar to Archfiend of the Dross in current Pioneer or in prior Standard. Though I think this is overall better than Archfiend, even though it doesn't have flying. Um, Ward discard a card is a real thing, um, though it is harder to gain life than to just, you know, play the Archfiend of the Dross out. But the upside, I think, on this far outweighs it. There's not very many ways in either format currently to deal with Unholy Annex, and there are other sources of life gain, as we've mentioned, that could be playable, Deep Cavern, Bat, some of these Soul Sister effects, etc. Withering Curse, so this one is our board wipe variant in black. This one is not as easy to trigger as the other infusion effects because this one's not a creature, so the Soul Sisters effects won't trigger it. So you need some other card that you're investing that's going to gain you life. It also doesn't work all that well with Deep Cavern Bat because it'll kill the bat and give them their card back. So I'm not really sure what the best way to enable this is in Standard. Maybe you play some sort of bad life gain land. There are a few, or there are some instants and sorceries that can at least gain you some life and kill a creature or something. So um, maybe there's enough enablers where it kind of is like, okay, so you just so it can sort of read more as discard a card to destroy all creatures, which is a little bit better. Okay, Ancestral Anger. This one's a reprint, notably on here because of Leyline of Resonance. Fuck this card, fuck Leyline, I hate all that shit. But absolutely, like, pretty good in those types of decks. Maybe Prowess plays it. Blazing Firesinger. This one, I don't really expect to see much play in Standard or Pioneer. Um, Maybe there's a home for it in some of these other decks, in some of these other formats, because Seething Song is still a powerful payoff, though it is not quite as good because you do have to untap with it to actually go up on mana. Otherwise, you're spending 6 mana to get 5. So unless you have some sort of good cost reduction effect, I guess you could play it in like Ruby Storm or whatever. It doesn't immediately let you go Ruby into this, right? Because it'd be 2 to play this, and then you need another 2 to do the Seething Song. But if you have any of the rituals, then you can play this, and then it's another ritual, and then go up from there. So maybe it's totally fine in, say, like Modern or something. In Pioneer, maybe you can use it to ramp into Deathbell Warcry or something. I'm not really sure like what like a big good red payoff would be. Cavalier Flame maybe or something. Um, but I think it's mostly going to be for other formats. Emeritus of Conflict. Look, I'm a fan of casting Lightning Bolts, though I don't think this one will actually be casting all that many. 3 spells is not very easy to do. You can bank it, as in you can play this on 2, cast 3 1-mana spells on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you can Lightning Bolt. That'll be a spell because the prepared spell is cast, so that would count as one of your spells. And then you can just cast 2 more spells and then cast another Lightning Bolt. Um, you do need to like untap with this in this current format of either Standard or Pioneer, where there's a lot of cheap red removal and a good amount of boomerang basics. Um, but it is a 2-drop you can actually develop pretty early and get value from later. So maybe there's a home for this. Maybe it's good enough in some of these red decks, though paradoxically, it is a red aggro creature that's actually quite bad in the normal curve out mono red aggro decks. It's substantially better as an Is It Split card. Okay. Flashback, obviously, just gives the spell flashback, instant speed. Snapcaster Mage, it is not. Snapcaster Mage gave you a body, which actually was quite relevant because it itself baked in a win con and was a 2-for-1. You could Snapcaster, play a kill spell, block with Snapcaster, get your value from there. But this does enable some stuff that we haven't really seen in a while. You can pair it with cards that care if they were cast from graveyard or from anywhere other than hand, like See the Truth, Esper Origins. You could play this target Esper Origins on turn 3 and then flip your Esper Origins on turn 3. You can pair it with the spell that makes 2/2 spirits, and this would still count as casting it not from hand, so you would get the counters on all of your spirits. Maybe there are some decks like Spelementals or Jeskai Control or something where they play enough density of cards that they would want to get back again, that you could play one or two copies of this. Okay. Impractical Joke. This is our Strangle variant in this set, and we haven't really had Strangle recently in Standard. And while instant speed is pretty important in a Badger Mole Cub Slick Shot Show Off formats, it is quite nice to actually have a removal spell that can deal with a 3 toughness creature. So I would expect this to see play, and it's also relevant with Flow State. Okay. One of our Paradigm cards. The only real reason this is on here is because you could theoretically build a deck around this, because you can cast any number of the spells that you exile. So if you have a lot of like cheap cards in your deck, this could be like, oh, let's cast 3 cards, and if you hit another copy of it, you can still just cast it. And it still does work. Sometimes you can high roll with it because it's total mana value 4 or greater. So if you hit like a 1 and a 2 and then a 5, you still get to cast all 3 of them. So maybe there's some kind of deck you could build around with this. Though generally, I think the Paradigm cards are fairly safe costed. Okay. Maelstrom Artisan. This card is definitely one of the 3-drops we've been looking for in traditional mono red, in Standard at least. Pioneer has Screaming Nemesis, but in Standard. So sure, it dies to Burst Lightning and dies to a lot of other creatures, but it does restrict the opponent on turn 4. So pretty nice card on curve. You just play it, hit for 3, untap, you can blow up a land, and then maybe you play like a Lightning Strike or something, you kill the creature, you hit them again. Now they're further behind in development. So is it one of the missing pieces that Red had? Probably not, but it will be pretty nice to see. Unfortunately, I don't like how this plays with Boomerang Basics, as in I will blow up your land and then Boomerang Basics my Artisan, and then be able to do it all over again. So, okay. Molten Core Maestro. This is yet another one of the prowess but not prowess type of effects. This one snowballs pretty quick because it just gets counters. Menace is a nice thing to have. Just totally ignore the 5 or more mana. It's not going to happen all that often, though with a card like Burst Lightning it can. But again, most games it's not going to. This card kind of just grows. I think this is going to see a bit of Standard play. It's certainly better than Elusive Otter, though it's definitely worse than the rest of the threats that prowess plays, so I'm not really sure how many you could fit in. But Menace does make this similarly as evasive as Elusive Otter. Okay, Steal the Show. Another one of our specifically fuck Kaido type cards. This also can kill any sort of big creature, similar to what Beacon Bolt was doing in the Arclight Phoenix decks in the Guilds of Ravnica format. Though this also has the upside of it can enable itself, which we haven't really seen in those types of effects before. We have Combustion Technique in current Standard, which cares about lessons, 2+ lessons, but this one you can just target yourself early and then rummage your hand away. I can envision a fair amount of scenarios where Spelementals just actively wants to do that, even if you have one of your payoff cards in hand, because you have so many and so many cantrips now that you just need to control the board into your development turns. So. All right, Ambitious Augmenter. So this one is likely unplayable, but we have seen Experiment 1 type cards be played before. This one does have the increment mechanic, which means this thing grows as you continue to spend mana on more and more expensive cards. But currently most of the green decks are trying to use Badger Mole Cubs, so I don't really think there's going to be very much of a home for this card in Standard. Maybe you can play it in some sort of weird version of Landfall, though Chocobo is substantially better, and Land Elves is still a better 1-drop, so I'm not even sure that you'd want to be playing this. Okay, Comforting Counsel. So a strange life gain payoff to have in green, but one that is pretty good when you can get it active. I do have a couple of decks I've tried in Pioneer and Standard with this that play a lot of the Soul Sisters, and then you play this and you play some creatures, and you can pretty quickly just grow all your Soul Sisters into being real threats. So while I don't think this is like an incredible deck, I think it's totally fine. Okay. Emeritus of Abundance. I'm pretty high on this Emeritus, even though there's not very many decks currently that are playing green that really are interested in this type of value play rather than just here's my next big fatty. But this does potentially enable some green-based mid-range decks like Golgari or Abzan or things of that nature, because they do have access to a Den Protector now. 3 mana, 3/4 Vigilance is a real stat line in this type of format. And it can buy back anything. Typically, we've seen the green creatures as of late only be able to get back permanents, but this can get back instants and sorceries. So you can also play this in your Formidable Speaker decks. So now you can Formidable Speaker for an Emeritus and get back, maybe a Superior Spider-Man if they're all gone, or get back a kill spell, right? Or a Duress to clear the way. You could play this in the Omniscience deck, and you can Formidable Speaker for a way to get back like a board wipe or something, which has come up. I've played a lot of the Teamer Omniscience deck, and there's a fair amount of games where you actually would want to Formidable Speaker in those types of lines. You don't necessarily have the mana to Speaker for Avatar for Ill-Timed Explosion. So, just more diversity with that. Okay, next one. Oh, I guess that's what I also forgot. So, Emeritus also works with Collected Company and Michelangelo's Technique. Because it's a green creature you can get off of them that can then put that card back into your hand. We currently don't have anything in Pioneer that lets you that's in green-white, that lets you Coco into it, that then also gets back Coco the way that the modern versions were doing with Eternal Witness. So very exciting to see how those developments work. Environmental Scientist. This is a card that I am curious if it's playable enough at 2 mana. Traditionally, this type of effect has been 3 mana before. Borderland Rangers, Civic Wayfinders, things of that nature. Traditionally not constructed playable at 3, though sometimes. But at 2 mana, it could be enough. I kind of struggle to see where you would really want to play this. Like, you really can't afford to play it in Cub. It doesn't really do very much there. And the Cub decks are the primary green decks. Landfall, maybe, because it is a 2 mana play that does get you a land drop on the next turn. Though its immediate power level is fairly low, and Landfall does tend to play a fairly high number of lands. So, not really sure, but definitely one I would like to try and test. Germination Practicum. This is one of the other Paradigm cards on here. This one is on here exclusively because there are a fair amount of games where you can get a bunch of mana and they just like kill or counter your payoff creatures, and there's just another one that like turns all of your mana dorks into winning the game in the way that Burrow would. It's nowhere near as powerful, but maybe there's some type of scenario with it. Again, this does open up some stuff in Pioneer with the learn mechanic, with Professor of Symbology, and things like that. But largely a fairly tame cycle. Oracle's Restoration is on here just for a red-green ley line of resonance. I don't really expect it to see play outside of that. Planar Engineering is here as a card that combo kills pretty quickly with Tifa or other landfall effects, because you play your land and then you play this on 4 and you sack and then you search for 4 basics, and that's 5 landfall triggers on turn 4. I think it's a little bit win more in any of these formats, but one that can make for some cool moments. Slumbering Trudge. This is just in here as a card that works with risks, similar to Moonshadow or any of those other types of effects. We have multiple big fatties in Standard / Pioneer now that have these types of restrictions, so yay for Heartless Act. Studious First Year, not too dissimilar from other types of 1-mana accelerants that are not mana dorks that we've seen. Arboreal Grazer, Insidious Fungus require you to currently have lands in hand. Font of Fertility and Pioneer is fairly similar to this type of card. Though I have actually been playing some standard decks with it because, there are some decks in Standard that would play Shared Roots, and having more access to that effect is pretty nice. You can play it in the loot deck, the blue-red loot that lets all your lands tap for 2 mana to cast instant sorceries. Um, so then it's kind of free when you've got Splunking. You can do some like weird kind of nonsense with that. But overall, like this is the type of card I'm really happy to see with this mechanic. Vastland Scavenger. I think this card is probably pretty bad. As weird as it is to be, 3 mana 4/4 with 2 upsides must not be good. But I don't think this card is like particularly good. I think where it's best is in a deck like Yuna potentially, because it can put the Yuna into play and then also have milled over cards to get back with Yuna. Though it is instant speed, so you could still just play this and then hold it up for the rest of the game. Starting from turn 5 onwards, and maybe that's got some kind of angle to it. But overall, I think this card is probably a little bit weak. Into the multicolor cards. Aziza, Mage Tower Captain, is just another one of those Boros Convoke type creatures. We haven't really seen very much of that in either Pioneer or Standard recently, though, as I mentioned in the set, they are giving us a lot of these effects. I'm not really sure if there's any sort of like combo-y thing you can do with this, but that's kind of where I would look at. Hey, Black Loafing Pest is exclusively in here for the curve with Deep Cavern Bat. You play Bat on 2, you play this on 3, you attack with Bat, you put a counter on this, and you put a counter on the Bat. And then that's a good curve. Hey, Colorstorm Stallion is in here largely for Spell Elementals. I wouldn't really expect this to see play in any of the other Izzet decks, in either Pioneer or Standard. But it is an elemental for Sunderflock, so sure, it doesn't reduce it by the most. Your Sunderflock is still going to cost you 6 mana when you have a Stallion, but it doesn't get bounced, and neither does the token by it. So it effectively has the prowess effect. But, the haste is like pretty good on curve, and that deck can actually get to 5 mana for a spell cast via just full rate on Winter Night Stories or Burst Lightning is significantly more common in the Sunderflock decks than it would be in the Slickshot Show-Off decks. So I think it has some potential there. Conciliator's Duelist is a card I'm very excited to brew with in both Standard and Pioneer. It's a very exciting black-white mid-range card in formats that are noticeably lacking those effects. Yeah, it's not the best defensive card, though it is a really good value thing in the same way that the other repartee cards are, which is you can pair it with removal spells, and then this one can always just blink itself, so if you play this, you draw a card, each player loses life, whatever, you untap, you can kill their creature, you can blink this, you can draw another card, and that's actually a pretty appealing thing, so... Yep, so definitely going to try and play this at Pioneer Weeklies, and absolutely going to test it in Standard. Dina's Guidance. This card is basically just here for Superior Spider-Man curves, similar to Formidable Speaker. If you have the Spider-Man already in hand, you can just put a fatty in graveyard from your deck. If you have a fatty in graveyard, off like a Bitter Triumph or something, you can Dina's Guidance for a Superior. Fix What's Broken is a really cool card to think about and build around. It doesn't return X or less, just X, so you do need to build your deck in a way that is likely 1 or 2 different types of mana costs that you're trying to put in. It's really cool to have a reanimation spell that you're like, okay, obviously the really cool play of I'll pay 7 or 8 life, I'll put in like 3 big fatties, and just kind of win the game from there is super cool. But you can also do other stuff with it where it's more copies of Raise the Past, for example, in the Raise the Past deck, where you can just return a bunch of 2s, and you've got, your free sack outlets and stuff like that from there. But you can also play it with a bunch of cycling cards in Pioneer, and a little bit in Standard. We have, because it returns artifacts and not just creatures, we do have Thundering Broodwagon in Standard that you can pair with it, and Trumpeting Carnosaur. And so, maybe there's some kind of angle from there. But in Pioneer, you can also play a bunch of cycling effects. So, really cool card. Geometer's Arthropod. Obviously, you can only play this in decks to play a bunch of X spells, and one of the paradoxes, of course, with a card like this is when you're spending a bunch of mana, presumably 3 to 4 more, with the X spells. You maybe don't need to find more X spells because you presumably already had a spell to sink all your excess mana into. So I'm not really sure that this really has any sort of home, but it does work with Mockingbird pretty well. So you can play this on two. You can play a Mockingbird copying it. It will trigger it. You'll get to draw a card, and now you have two arthropods for your next Mockingbird or Nature's Rhythm or anything like that. So Hardened Academic, mostly in here for Standard. I don't think this really makes the cut in Pioneer. We have tons of discard outlets on 2-drops in Pioneer that make themselves indestructible, and this does not. Whereas in Standard, this is another way to enable Monuments on turn 3. So if you play this on 2 and then Monuments, you can just immediately discard 3 cards to get all the modes and then do it on your opponent's turn. You can also do that with Iron Shield Elf currently in Standard as well. So maybe there's some sort of Mardu Monument deck that pops up as a result of this. Killian's Confidence. I had mentioned before for the Repartee cards that there were some black-white instants and sorceries that are fine to cast on your opponent's creatures and your own, and this is one of them where it's not really good to cast on your opponent's creature, but it will just cycle. But the big one here is this is not bad to have in those types of repartee mid-range decks because it itself does bring it back, so it is a card advantage engine with that, but it will also trigger your repartee effects. So it pairs really well with the 2-drop that makes the 1/1 flyer because you can just target that, attack for 3, draw your card. You'll make a 1/1 flyer, which will presumably trigger this, or you can just get this back immediately and just keep your engine going from there. So looking to cast this a bunch in Standard and Pioneer testing. Mind into Matter. I have cast a lot of this in like the Kona decks and the Loot decks, LUTE from this set. Notably, this is not a growth spiral. It's draw X cards, so at 2 mana, it's draw 0 cards, and then you can put a land, basically, into play from your hand tapped, which is not an unplayable card, but it does scale quite well. So pretty happy to have access to this one for anyone who likes to be casting Spelunking as their magic card of choice. So fully expect this card to see a bit of play, though at sorcery speed, it really doesn't have very many fair uses. Moment of Reckoning, unlikely to see very much play, but really exciting card that does solve some of the problem of reanimation spells in that, at least in current, era of Magic, reanimating something like, say, Atraxa or Valgaboth is not even all that good. But this, in theory, you could put, 2 things back into play and then also blow up 2 things. And that could be worth 7 mana. So we haven't really seen something like this before, but if there's like a 7 mana, reanimation, game-ending type of play in those types of decks, this card is maybe a part of it. Practice Scrollsmith. This is another one of our Snapcaster variants in this set, but this one does a lot of weird, funky things. So, like, first of all, it's red-white, which is a really strange color combination to be in. But it on the plus side, it has, like, reasonable stats. 3/2 First Strike is actually, like, pretty good. It's going to be really hard to block. It's hard to attack through. It does pressure the opponent pretty well. But it does something that the other effects don't, in that it exiles the card from graveyard, and then you get to cast it until the end of your next turn. So if it's your turn and you have excess mana, you can still play this as like a Songcrafter mage, target your whatever, cast it, whatever. But you can still just play this out on 3, targeting whatever you cast on 2, and then on turn 4, you can still play that card on 2. Like, you can play the card on 4, like for 2 mana or whatever, and then double spell from there, and you still have gotten value from your Snapcaster Mage, even though you played it on curve as a creature. We haven't really seen very much like that before, and I think that changes a lot of how you have to evaluate something like this. It also can target any non-creature as opposed to just instants and sorceries, so the aforementioned Mardu Monument stuff. You can target a monument with this. And then just cast the monument on turn 4, like the turn after this. So a lot of potential, I think, for this card. I will absolutely be casting it in Standard and Pioneer. Not necessarily at high level, but in our testing. Prismari Charm, so we have charms in this set. The Isn't one, of course, feels pretty good. Nothing really spectacular about this. Surveil 2, then draw a card is like a nice enabler in the Spell Elementals deck. It also gives them a way to bounce their own creature that's not bounce off, while also being able to bounce something like Rest in Peace. So I think it's a pretty good upgrade for Spell Elementals, even though it's a bit less good in Lessons and um, the Prowess decks. So, yeah, totally solid card. Professor Delian fell largely in here. I mean, I haven't really cast very much of this card, but it does tick up to 7 loyalty, theoretically, on the turn you play it, so you can just immediately ult it on 5, and then it's pretty easy to kill your opponent from there with various, Bloodthirsty Conqueror nonsense, or just um, Enduring Tenacity, like double up on that type of stuff. Like plus, like gain a bunch of life. So pretty weird. It does answer the board at least with like you can play it. You can minus destroy a creature, and then you can just start drawing cards and losing life. So it kind of does everything you want a planeswalker to do, even if it may end up being not very good. Okay, Quandrix Charm, the next charm. So this one is kind of like our Make Disappear variant of the set, countering spell unless they pay 2. We've seen a lot of those see play. Make Disappear in prior standard formats. We have It'll Quench Ya in this standard format, which mostly sees play in Lessons, but Simic Cub in particular can play this. There's also some weird things where like this can blow up an Artist Talent. It can blow up a Shelter by Ghosts. There's enough random enchantments laying around, Storm Chaser's Talent in particular, that this can be good against. But you can also do some silly things with Urborvoid, where you put the Urborvoid trigger on the stack, and then you Quandrix Charm, and now they all get 5 counters on them. And then you kill your opponent because you had a 2-mana Crater Hoof. So fully expect this one to see a pretty solid amount of play. Resonating Loot. This is the loot card I referred to before. I've quite liked this a lot. It's very easy to just get an absurd amount of mana with this. And even if you're doing fair things with it, like you play this on 4, and you untap, you can like Jeskai Revelation them. Or you can Mystical Teachings for something and just kind of go off from there. So very easy to immediately leverage. Plays really well with things like Shared Roots and other ramp spells. And you do actually get to draw a card off of it on curve a lot. So one of the maybe sleeper rares in Pioneer or Standard to come out of this. Sure, it's an artifact. It dies to a lot of things. And in some cases, you have to untap with it to get value. But, it's not quite Wilderness Reclamation, but it is fairly similar. Sanar, Unfinished Genius. I don't really expect very much out of Sanar, but notably in here because 2-mana 0/4 that taps to make a treasure every turn is something we haven't really seen very often before. So something to think about in some of these spells decks, or maybe in the loot deck. Next up, our next charm on here, Silver Quill Charm. This is the other black-white instant sorcery card for the Repartee decks, because you can always target your own creature, or you can target your opponent's small creature, get the extra few points of burn to push the finish line. I don't expect this to be as good as the blue-red charm in terms of format penetration for either Pioneer or Standard. Exile a creature with power 2 or less has a small window of effectiveness in both of these formats, and 2 counters is not the most effective in formats with a lot of cheap removal. It's harder to do that. Lightning Helix doesn't typically go face very much either, so nothing about this charm I think is like exceptional, but because it is a removal spell that can also trigger your Repartees on empty boards, I think it's totally reasonable. Dramatic Critique, another card that has been getting some hype for Standard, though I do think it has potential in Pioneer as well. But in Standard, this is just significantly better than Abandoned Attachments in Spelementals. It's not likely to make the cut in something like Prowess, though there could be an argument for it, because it does enable Flow State pretty easily on turn 3 or turn 4. But in Spelementals, it also doubles as a burn spell / removal spell on smaller creatures. And I've played a lot of games with it, and it is fantastic in that type of deck. So definitely one to keep an eye out for. Vibrant Outburst. Once again, is it gets playable magic cards. What's new, you know? Um, Lightning Strike that also taps a creature. I think this one got a little bit overhyped by people heading into set release. I found myself a little bit short on turns where I would actually be able to use both modes, though it mostly comes up against Badgermal Cub, where on their upkeep you can kill their cub and then tap their land and just stunt them down a bunch of mana. But generally speaking, it's not that much different than Lightning Strike. Vicious Rivalry. This is our Culling Ritual type card in this set. It should change a fair amount about standard because, like, because you get to choose paying the life. So, like, if you have a 3-drop and then you play this, you can just pay 2 life to blow all the 2s, and that's relevant. But it also blows up artifacts, which can matter too right now, though it doesn't quite line up very well against Monument because in either Standard or Pioneer, because usually by the time Monument comes down, they're triggering it that turn and maybe the next turn as well. And then you kind of take 9 points of damage to kill that. But generally speaking, we haven't really had a reasonable 4-mana board wipe in Standard that's not like Day of Judgment. Ill-Timed Explosion sees a little bit of play, but this one does open up a bit of Sentinel of the Nameless City type mid-range, just, playing 3-drop mid-range. It does work really well with the Green Emeritus as well, because you can sweep up the small creatures and then get this back later in the game and then clear up whatever you need to. Witherbloom Charm. Another charm, another kill spell. Not nearly as good in Standard, I think, as the others are. Though in Pioneer, this has applications not really in like the primary green-black deck of Greasefang, but in the Cauldron Familiar decks, where it is another Deadly Dispute effect, but it can also blow up Rest in Pieces and stuff like that. Notably, it doesn't hit 3s, so it doesn't blow up Monument, and it doesn't blow up Greasefangs, but it does kill Gory Steelcutter, and that's something that is exceptionally powerful in Pioneer. Next one we have is Witherbloom the Balancer, the only Elder Dragon card I have on here. This one, I don't really think there's anything that immediately jumps to mind as like super broken to do with it in Standard or Pioneer that like makes a lot of sense. But again, like, anytime you have a cost reduction effect, it's always something to think about. This is not a hard card to cast for cheap to get a 5/5, and it does play very well with Nature's Rhythm. It's already pretty easy to abuse Nature's Rhythm in both Standard and Pioneer with like Badgermal Cub, but maybe having more ways to do that is nice. Next one up is Page Looseleaf, a card that I've been pretty excited about. Actually, weirdly have a couple decks in Pioneer for it. I don't really expect it to see much play in Standard at all, but in Pioneer, we can play it with Emery and Retraction Helix combo, because it can find your Retraction Helix, and it's an artifact you can cast off of Emery. So if you mill one and have one in hand, you can Emery this, immediately Grandeur, get the Retraction Helix, and then pretty reasonably Sewer Valence combo your opponents. Notably in Standard, where I did try it out, and it was actually like pretty good, was in Raise the Past specifically. It's a 2-mana creature you can get back with Raise the Past. It solves some of your issues of playing a low land count, because while most of your things require fairly strict colored mana, you can use the generic mana for other effects as well, and, well, for casting Raise the Past. But notably, if you don't play any other instance and sorcery removal spells, this will always grab a Raise the Past off of the Grandeur. But it still lets you play stuff like Duskrose Reliquary as removal spells in the sideboard, so you still do get the option to interact with your opponent. So maybe there's something in Pauper going for this, but in Pioneer in particular, I liked it in the Retraction Helix deck, and in Standard, I liked it in Raise the Past. Great Hall of the Biblioplex. It's not quite as good as many of the other manlands we have in Standard, because 5 mana for a 2/4 is a lot. Now, but as we have seen from Soulstone Sanctuary, when you pay mana to, even though you're overpaying for the creature, and it permanently becomes a creature, that usually has a good amount of potential. Currently in Standard, we have multiple different decks that are blue-red that care about casting instance and sorcery spells. that don't actually play any sort of man lands. Like sometimes they'll play Agnikellas, but generally you don't play any creature lands, even though in many cases they would actually want creature lands because you can't really play Soulstone Sanctuary. And the blue-red creature land from Caverns of Ixalan sucks. This one, however, I think is pretty good because it still lets you cast any of the lessons. It also lets you potentially solve some of the rest in peace issue that spell-elementals can have, where now you can play this, and yes, it can't cast your Eddie Merc Crab, and it can't cast your Sunderflocks, but it can cast everything else in your deck, and this is also a green source for any sort of disenchants that you end up playing, like Origin of Metal Bending or something, which we have also seen play in some of the Teamer Lessons decks will sometimes play Origin of Metal Bending, which this can also cast, while also doubling as a Soulstone Sanctuary for them. 5 mana is much more than 4, and 2/4 is a little bit overall worse, but synergizes very well with the deck. So fully expect this card to be pretty playable. I believe this is the last card I'm going to talk about. I don't really have much to say about it because it doesn't really do very much in Standard. And in Pioneer, what's the best you can do with it? Well, you could maybe shut down Port of Carfel or Beseiju or something like that. But in neither Standard or Pioneer do we have very many abusing activated abilities of lands type effects, though it is nice to still have access to in these formats in case of something down the line. So this card definitely, I think, more important in Eternal formats. Though notably in Standard, we do have Archdruid's Charm, which can still find this at instant speed. So, yep. So that's it for the set review. I did release the deck dump of Standard decks onto my Patreon, which should be free to access for everyone this time. I am not queued for this Pro Tour. I'm not doing any Pro Tour prep with people either this time, but I am doing Cincinnati regionals, and I am doing DC regionals. So I do have a reason to test a lot of Standard and try a lot of things out. So, yeah, hope you enjoyed the set review.